Welcome back to the Palm Court Podcast. Mike Palmer here, joined again by Megan and Grant. Hey, folks.
Hi.
What's going on?
I don't know what's going on with you, man.
The world is revolving around the sun. There's an eclipse that's soon to hit, just to
Yeah.
put this in astrophysical senses.
Right.
But
It's your birthday.
speaking of revolving around the sun, yes. And yeah, so it's all those things. And then there's more to talk about because we have a wonderful guest who's joining us who is also part of the new college diaspora. I now call it a diaspora just because why not?
I think it's a fair enough diaspora.
Excellent. And that's Susan who's talking. So we're joined today by Susan Hirshberg. Susan, welcome to the Palm Court Podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
And we always start by hearing how our guests connect to the world that is New College. Can you catch us up on your origin stories?
Sure. I ended up at New College. I was in high school in Lexington, Massachusetts, and I had a bunch of outcast, highly intelligent, and really pretty nerdy and weird friends.
That's like the birthplace of our nation, I believe.
It
Lexington,
is.
right?
It
Yeah.
was, yeah. And I was there for high school. I had lived in a few other places before that. But being from Lexington, applying to New College was pretty unusual, although there was one or two other people from Lexington who had gone there. And but I did actually at one point I had one person from my high school who was like, "Oh, you applied to New College. We thought you were smart." And as if how could a smart person apply to some weird school in Florida that
Yeah.
was not Ivy League or no one had ever heard of it. I'm
Right.
like, well, I am smart, but that's probably why I'm going to New College. But what had attracted me to me was honestly the admissions literature, which was like, every student is responsible for their own education, and
Yeah.
particularly the opportunities to have independent study. And the thesis was actually appealing at that point. And, I particularly wanted to study animal behavior at that time, which is what I did study the whole time I was there. So
Yeah.
I knew what I wanted to do from the very beginning
Mm.
and set about kind of creating my own major in animal behavior, because at that point we didn't actually have areas of concentration anyway.
Mm.
But there were, sort of more established major type plans.
Got it.
But I knew as I was trying to create a study program in animal behavior, I was like, okay, I got to take some biology, I got to take some psychology, I'll
Right.
throw in whatever else seems like it works.
Mm.
That's pretty much what I did. I did have that plan all the way through.
And
Uh,
just on that front, what time period are we talking about?
in 1983,
Okay.
and leaving was a little bit fuzzier with regards to the date.
Sure.
Uh,
But like
either
early to mid 80s.
88 or 1989, depending on how you look at it.
Got it.
It did take a little extra time because I took a break during my second year.
Right.
I took a little extra time to finish the thesis. So
Mhm. Absolutely. Hey, I'm right there with you. I refer to it as the accelerated 5-year plan. So I feel
yeah,
like there's quite a few
yeah, and
folks.
there's a bit of a sub story as to why it was probably 1988 or 1989, which perhaps I'll get into, or perhaps I won't.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did end up graduating and
Yeah.
with a degree in animal behavior.
And then maybe just to get there right away, what was your thesis on? That's always a fun question to
Yeah.
ask people.
So my thesis, Megan was telling me my thesis people knew about even before they knew about me, was on pelican behavior. And so I sat in the cork tree that was down by the library every day for over a year, for at least an hour a day, different times of day. Sometimes I would get up at dawn. Sometimes, I did want there to be sunlight. So it was usually not after nightfall,
Mm.
but sometimes the sun would rise while I was out there. And I took data on about 26,000 instances of pelicans diving.
Yeah.
And so what I was looking for was I was trying to, I think probably most people who have seen the brown pelican will know that every once in a while you'll see at least two or three or, even more pelicans. They sort of come up together and they
Right.
dive into the water.
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out when specifically those paradigms would occur
Mm.
and what kind of environmental things might be happening.
Mm.
So as a result, I took data on a whole bunch of environmental variables as well as just the paradigms themselves.
Yeah.
I was looking at the state of the tide and the amount of light there was in the sky and where the
Mm.
wind was coming from.
And this
And
is
when
mostly down at exclusively down at the Bayfront?
Yeah, yeah. So as I say, my research station I was actually in the tree, and I was doing what was called focal behavior sampling, which was again specifically looking at every instance that I could find of these. I counted all the dives, whether they were happening alone or whether they were happening together with other birds.
Right. Yeah. Wow. I mean, and you must have learned a lot. Any quick lessons for us from
I
what you
did.
learned about pelicans?
Yeah, so I ended up giving a presentation at the National Animal Behavior Society. It's been a while since I've been involved with them.
Yeah.
That was on the findings that I had actually found, because with all of these different variables, it was a bit hard to actually do the data analysis
Yeah.
to come up with anything. So I was doing it a little bit kind of rough and ready.
Yeah.
But what I did find was that there was a relationship. It's really kind of interesting interaction between two sort of sinusoidal type patterns, which seemed to be related to whether the tide was ebbing or flowing. So there was sort of a relationship to the
Hmm.
moon
Hmm.
and also the time of year. What you would see was you would see sort of like every month there would be a sort of a peak, and it was also related to the tidal state. So this is related to the moon.
Mm.
It was more closely related to the tidal state. So Sarasota actually has an unusual tidal structure where it has what's called a mixed tide. So the tide sort of goes between having 2 tides a day to having 4 tides a day.
Mm.
And that happens about every 6 months.
Yeah. Is there a neap tide that we need to be thinking about here, Susan?
Yeah, so the birds would tend to dive, when the tide was doing a particular thing,
I
and it
see.
was not so much, the neap tide versus the ebb tide as it was, kind of the relationship to this overall pattern of
Yeah. So it's more like a system level
yeah.
pattern as opposed to
There were
any
there were
individual variable.
2 cycles sort of working together. So what you would see is you would see this like zigzaggy pattern that had about a 6-month amplitude, and then it would stop, and then it would
Yeah.
go another 6-month amplitude.
Yeah.
So it was a beautiful little finding.
Mm.
And I did present on that in 1987, at this conference.
Yeah. You probably never will look at a pelican the same way again.
I'm very fond of them now,
Yeah,
but
they're pretty I mean, like, I think anyone who spent time down by the bay, or really just
yeah,
around the water in Sarasota, like, you definitely get to know the pelicans, and, like, they
right.
definitely have both an individual intelligence and a social intelligence that
And they're
you really
amazing. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Just to see how they control their kind of big and ungainly kind of bodies, and
yeah,
uh they're really pretty fascinating.
yeah,
And at that time I was the only undergraduate to present at the national level at this conference.
that's awesome. Yeah, and that's
So
really, like, sort of an example of the ability to kinda chart your own path academically at New College.
yeah.
Have you been back to the tree? How's the tree doing?
Yeah, no, I've been back to the tree. I guess at the last reunion, I was back there.
Awesome.
And I was in my early 20s when I was doing this work. It was very easy for me to climb up, but when my mid 50s, it was less easy for me to climb up. So I was kind of like wiggling
Yeah,
around, wiggling a little bit, but I did manage to get up there. And
and how
yes,
how high up are we talking? Like, where were you perched exactly?
oh, it's not very high. It's like maybe 6 feet off the ground.
Okay.
You
Little bit of
know,
elevation though. Yeah, that's
yeah,
good.
but
Yeah,
the tree has gotten bigger and I've gotten weaker in the last, 35 years, so it's harder for me to get up it. But I
yeah,
also have a picture from my graduation of me, like, standing in the tree, and I'm wearing, like, a derby hat and elbow
yeah.
glove,
Well,
a floor
that
length, you
yeah,
know.
and that kinda speaks to, like, Megan, you mentioning that Susan kind of already had some lore around her by the time you got there in, like, '89, and then
Very much so. I
yeah,
mean, they used you to recruit people. I remember during
Oh,
my
did
time.
they? Nice, I did not know.
I know they think they sent, maybe it was a sort of mimeographed copy of an article about you, whether it was in the
Oh,
Nimbus
yeah.
or
Yeah, no, that's right.
about your research. I remember reading that when I was
Yeah,
thinking
it was
about going to
oh,
New College.
something
Yeah, I
like
remember that.
I can't remember, something like a cross between Annie Hall and I just
Jane Goodall? I don't know. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that could be, that could be. But yeah, and then when I read later on your story, that you shared with the alumni folks, I was shocked that you didn't get all of the support that I would have thought you should have gotten if they were using you as a
I was
recruiting.
I know, and unfortunately, I really needed, for instance, my mom to help me get to the point where I could actually give that presentation because I wasn't getting that kind of information from my advisor about
Mm,
how to present at a national conference,
mm,
Um,
Well, your mom had more experience
my
than your
boss
advisor, right?
she is a PhD physicist who had presented, hundreds of papers at
mm,
that. So it's not like she was a slacker in that way. So yeah, there were some pretty significant issues around my thesis and around my graduation, which didn't really happen the way I would have liked them to, and also around yeah, the advising process. But I did appreciate being able to study animal behavior from the beginning and to try to create my own, I loved doing the thesis. I loved
mm.
taking the research, but yeah, the bits that didn't work out as well were less pleasant for sure.
Do you ever think about your thesis and all of the data processing that's available now and how much easier? I mean, you were doing this all by hand. I don't think young people
Yeah.
now could imagine what you were doing, how much work it must have been.
So yeah, I mean that was another weird little thing. So I got my little Mac computer as a graduation present in order so I could graduate. So I mean I was like in 1988, kind of entering everything by hand, yes, and sort of, I basically had the equivalent of an Excel spreadsheet and a graphing program.
Mm,
And so I was able to graph some things, but I didn't really have the statistical abilities that I,
right,
would have had. I had never taken a class in statistics at all.
right.
So the Al, my advisor, was like, "Oh, you should take non-parametric statistics," but actually, what I really needed was sort of basic level statistics.
Mhm,
And so it was kind of like coming from sort of logic, and I was doing these random chi-square type things, and I looked up a formula for doing some t-tests, and but I was mostly trying to end up doing that. I found the nice result with the sinusoids
yeah,
purely by graphing it,
mhm,
honestly. So so
yeah.
yeah, so I did some hand graphing. I did,
Well, even hand coding, I imagine, like, nowadays, it does seem like a lot of like, we're in a more of a
yeah, I
surveillance and tagging
put in the
state.
little formulas for how to sum up different ranges of things. Yeah, I
Right,
mean, but
Yeah.
it was fairly innocuous kind of stuff. I mean, working with the old Excel spreadsheet. But
yeah,
interestingly, I find those old spreadsheets easier to work with than I do the present ones because I
mm,
can do more manipulations. Now there seems to be a difference between a spreadsheet and then the word, the
mm. Even
spreadsheet.
the data collection side almost reminds me more of, like, a photography essay rather than
Yeah,
the way someone.
definitely like writing it in a notebook. Oh, look,
Yeah,
there's a Pelican dive. Oh, look,
right.
there's a take the data each time of what the wind was doing and where it was coming from and the light conditions were and those kinds of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, which is it's interesting to think about that though, because research has changed significantly
Yeah,
over the
it-
years. Yeah. But then you're also mentioning that, your story wasn't without challenges. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that.
yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. So again, kind of coming from my background where, you know, suburban Boston, where all of my friends were going to places like Oberlin and, Ivy Leagues
Yeah.
and
Seven
that.
Sisters and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's sort of an expectation of how academia works, right? And some of that was that there was more freedom at New College and more ability to do my own stuff, but it also happened that I felt that there was some really significant aspects of irresponsibility on the part of the faculty. And with regards to me, I think some of that irresponsibility was quite harmful.
Mm,
Uh, it felt like there was something that I never quite understood that got in there that made things really scary and really abusive.
mm,
And it definitely wasn't on the part of all the faculty at all.
mm,
But being in the position of being an undergraduate at that level of power
mhm.
from a particular faculty member, I don't think most other institutions would have had that kind of unsupervised power dynamic.
Yeah.
There
I
was no
didn't.
oversight really for
Yeah, I
us.
mean, in fact, decades later, after I'd had a really hard time, sort of, I mean, I had already been at this national animal behavior conference. Decades later, it occurred to me that it's like any other college would have just said, "Oh, hey, you've already found this thing. Why don't you just write that up and make that your thesis?"
Right.
Right?
Oh,
Any other college
Sure.
would. I had already been presented at a national level.
Mhm.
Uh, but at New College, it was like, let's write a 100-page thesis and all this weird
Yeah.
shit just, came down on me
Right.
to the point that in 1988, the reason that was fuzzy about when I graduated was I'd had my baccalaureate. I had thought certain things were happening. Right before I was going to graduate, I heard from a third person that my advisor had said that I wasn't going to graduate unless I
Mm.
completely wrote my thesis. I did completely try to rewrite my thesis. I ended up graduating for a blank piece of paper.
Mm.
Was probably there. I don't know how much people in general knew, but I walked out, and that took me a lot of effort even to get that blank piece of paper. And then
Mm.
like again, completely rewrite the thesis, and then it turned out that that requirement to rewrite my thesis was not approved by the committee. It was just coming from my advisor.
Mm.
S
Ooh.
So it was a ton of different ways in which it was abusive.
Hmm.
And I ended up, I had nightmares about New College for decades
Yeah.
after this. And so, I mean, I feel bad about getting into this, like, crappy part of the story because I
Sure.
kind of like your podcast. You want the good things about New College, but this was not a good thing about New College.
when you told the story, the people who were at your baccalaureate who commented on it were also traumatized. I think
Yeah.
just there was a little group therapy session, just you
And
talking about it and bringing up just the people who witnessed what
well,
happened to
I
your
mean, the
baccalaureate.
baccalaureate was weird, but the baccalaureate was not the worst part by far. It was
Mm.
what happened
Mhm.
after the baccalaureate that
Yeah.
was that.
Yeah.
Seems like passive aggressive stuff too,
It
like
wasn't
not
positive
like
at all.
direct
There's no
communications.
passivity about it. I mean,
Yeah.
I had a man who, as I was fainting on the floor of his laboratory, crossed over my face without offering to help me up.
Mm.
And, that gets to be pretty
Yeah.
weird.
I meant more
Uh,
just the not communicating with you directly at that. So that at least that piece
Yeah,
felt passive aggressive to me, but it sounds like
yeah.
there was even
You
more.
know, no, there was some serious shit, and it should
Yeah.
not have.
Mm.
And and unfortunately, I was not the only person who had weird stuff like that happen. I mean, I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
I had one friend who was like, she's like, "Susan, every year somebody gets kind of screwed, and this year it's you. Aren't you lucky?"
Yeah.
But I think that that was a thing, that every year there would be at least one student who's just like, "What the fuck is
Right.
happening?"
Right.
Yeah. That it becomes the focus of all that energy or yeah, I think
Yeah, and something just really strange, for a
Mhm.
young kid who's like in
Yeah.
their early 20s or something.
'Cause it's hard enough just to finish your thesis,
Yeah.
assuming you have the support of your advisors, because that's the model is interesting. It works if all faculty are working in a positive way in the best
Yeah,
interests of their
and
students.
and then historically also, New College is unusual in the amount to which faculty members will engage in sexual relationships with students.
Mm.
I don't know
Mhm.
as much, but that was unusual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of an aspect of, well, it's okay because 'cause we're at this funky university, that the rules don't apply to us. But
Right.
I think in combination, not that all the things that happened to, students were because of this sort of weird sexual stuff, but I think it was really hard for New College faculty to actually look at their own levels of responsibility sometimes
Mhm.
to some of the students. And so I that was by far, I would say, the most negative thing that happened to me at New College.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I mean, I also had some great experiences with other faculty.
Mhm.
Um, but after I graduated, I had nothing to do with the alumni organizations for a while,
Yeah.
and I never gave money to New College. And finally, my first college roommate, who was Susan Spazi,
Oh,
she
yeah.
actually she actually called me up and she's like, "So we've noticed you've like never ever given any money to New College." I was like, "Well, thank you for actually having that conversation because, that was the first time anybody
Hmm.
had ever sort of thought to actually ask me
Yeah.
why I wasn't giving money to New College." And in fact, after that conversation, I started giving money to New College. And then when the New College Diamonds kind of got created and it was bringing back all the people because the people, the students were sort of like the opposite. It's like far more important to me to support those other students
Yep.
than it was
Yeah.
to support the overall program.
Hmm.
And so again, seeing those stories and being able to talk as like real people, I think brought me back to all of those folks so that by the time there was that reunion in 2018, I did want to go and I did
Right.
go.
Hmm.
And I have been sort of in my own sort of weird way involved in the resistance and
Yeah.
it's
And
just a
even if
weird given that I have such mixed feelings about the university.
it's really nice to get the broader perspective, though. Thank you for being, open about your story because I feel like there is a risk as part of the resistance because our culture is kind of being attacked to present like an overly idealized version of what the culture is and what some of its flaws are. Like we have talked in the past about how there's not enough faculty there, so that if you like another example, Jim Roth left. He was my advisor the first year, and he was an amazing psychology
Yeah, and he was
professor.
actually on my committee, and he was great. I
He's
Oh,
a
yeah.
phenomenal guy, but he had to leave. So like he left, and then suddenly, fortunately, I landed with Charlene Levy, then Charlene Callahan. Char was amazing, and
right,
I had
yeah,
Doug Langston in the middle. But like you're kind of stringing along, hoping you land with the right person, and this is as like a guy who really didn't have as much of the risk of like some sexual stuff happening. This you know, way before Me Too, way before even sexual. This is right around like Clarence Thomas
yeah, yeah,
time, so I feel like just the culture through which the mechanisms you would have if there was a problem with these power dynamics when the faculty have this autonomy, which is great if they're good. Um,
yeah.
it's a real truth about the structure that thank you for bringing it up here.
Well, I think that, undergraduates are basically treated like graduate students, which has advantages and has disadvantages. And
Mhm.
I now know enough about graduate school to also you say, some of that kind of weird abusive power dynamic stuff happens in graduate schools as
Sure.
Yeah.
well.
Mhm.
Does.
Uh,
Yeah.
but it is more unusual, I think in an undergraduate
Yeah, and the
institute.
power differential is greater, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and there was just no infrastructure there was no one to go to. I know in my time, we also tried to address something like this, and there was no one there. It was you and the provost just sitting in their office trying to work it out, and it's
Oh,
very
Victor was
scary.
I mean,
Mm.
honestly, he was helpful.
Mhm.
He was the one who made it so that I could actually walk in the graduation and get my blank diploma.
And then how
I
about
wonder.
professionally since New College? Can you just catch us up on like there's a long story
Okay.
there.
Yeah, there is. So it is in some ways a very new college story. One of the things I found out was that I had been told that references were written, but they really weren't, particularly again by my advisor. So the number of graduate schools I did get into the University of Wisconsin and I got into Northwestern. And I would have liked to have gone to Northwestern because I wanted to study with Alex the Talking Gray Parrot, but I couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
Uh, so I ended up going to the University of Wisconsin and I wanted to continue to study animal behavior there, but I sort of made a slightly bad decision because I was really interested in what's called cognitive ethology, which is observing kind of the cognitive and emotional, really what you can tell about the internal world of animals from their
Mhm.
external.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I kind of thought I was like, oh, birds are nice, but I'd like to study mammals now.
Yeah.
So instead of going over to the zoology department, so the animal behavior at University of Wisconsin was split between several different departments. So I ended up going into the comparative psychology, into the psychology department, and they had me, trying to do stuff in a lab with animals that were unhappy, and so I was really unhappy.
Yeah.
So I ended up kind of quitting and taking the master's. And then I had this whole sort of new college experience of like I ran off to New Zealand to think about things for a while, and then
Nice.
decided wanted to go into the nonprofit world, which I had done a little bit after college and before graduate school.
Yeah.
Well, so I moved to Washington, D.C. and applied for something like 200 jobs. And I got one in Santa Fe, New Mexico, working with radioactive waste in Los Alamos National
Oh,
Laboratory.
wow.
I had been doing a little bit with radioactive waste, as I say, in between college and graduate school.
Mm.
And
And Susan, you didn't become a superhero as part of that research, right? There is some
oh,
history
but
and
well,
kind of.
sort of. I mean, maybe a little because, yeah, I don't. You say there's some history. My uncle was at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project.
Oh, wow.
I just saw him in the background in Oppenheimer playing
That's
violin.
Oppenheimer. Anyway, so my uncle was Richard Feynman,
Oh,
and
wow.
um, so as a result of it sort of getting around in Santa Fe that my uncle was Richard Feynman,
Mm.
I actually have some whistleblowers, one whistleblower in particular, who wanted me to know about certain places that radioactive waste was going that
Oh,
it wasn't
wow.
going. So that kind of became this big expose that we ended up working on. And I was going into fields which kids were playing on. And so you could go, we went out with Geiger counters and I was like, oh,
Oh,
look,
wow.
this has a rather high, radiation rate. And there was a laundry that was sort of laundering some of the clothing that people were
Right.
wearing.
Yeah.
Uh, and the water from the laundry was going into, various other aspects of the watershed.
Oh, my God.
And also at the time in Santa Fe, if you know how Los Alamos is located, it's up on a bunch of finger mesas.
Yeah.
And there's water that flows down like, tributaries of the Rio Grande or the Rio Grande itself. And there's a lot of First Nations populations that
Mm.
live in sort of these pueblos, little, communities around the laboratory.
Wow.
And one of those pueblos, well, actually, in general, the pueblos are really famous for their gorgeous blackware pottery.
Mm.
So it was turning out that the potters were becoming ill because they were gutting clay from the Rio Grande, which
Oh,
was
wow.
had plutonium coming in from Los Alamos.
Right.
Yeah.
So there, that was a whole big other aspect of the environmental contamination around Los
Wow.
Alamos.
Huh.
And in general, the pueblos were having, there's quite a lot of really unusual cancers that were
Mm.
showing and things like that. So I was trying on those issues. But I ended up having some problems with depression. And so I ended up quitting,
Yeah.
became a nonprofit consultant for
Yep.
quite a while. So
Mhm.
I was with a bunch of other nonprofits doing things like, whatever projects it were that they needed to be done. So
Mhm.
research projects or strategic planning. And then I went to Minnesota and joined actually a guy who had been one of my best friends when I was in high school, and we got married.
Ah.
Oh, wow. So I became the executive director of a sort of environmental education facility for a while until I got pregnant, and then I had difficulty kind of working and
Yeah.
having young kids at the same time. So I was out of the workforce for about 9 years.
Okay.
Then I did this massive career change. Where in part because my brain changed a little bit when I had
Yeah.
kids, and I became an alternative healthcare practitioner doing Reiki and craniosacral therapy.
Nice.
And I did that for about 10 years. And that's interestingly enough, I sort of brought back the animal behavior because I started working on animals with
Mm.
animals.
Hmm.
And so I had some really kind of interesting experiences with that. But, I tried to say that I was doing it from the behavior perspective rather than the healing perspective because I didn't want to come off as pretending to be of that. And then a few years ago, my mom had been involved in the whole sort of the first IPCC thing about, scientists saying, oh, actually climate change is really an issue.
Yeah.
Because her work with the sun is often sort of quoted as like why climate change doesn't exist. But no, climate change is real. So she had always wanted to, to be able to do something about climate change. And so about 5 years ago, I took another sort of turn and I started working on climate change issues.
Mm.
And I basically started volunteering and created the Joan Feynman Climate Change Fund,
Hmm.
which uh, was specifically to sort of help rural communities with whatever projects they wanted to be doing on climate change.
That's
Um,
amazing. Yeah.
In Nova
yeah,
Scotia, right? Or is it all over? Is it?
that's Nova Scotia. So the foundation I was working with is called the Rural Communities Foundation of Nova Scotia. And, we've given out, I would say 40 to 50 grants, to different communities to do all kinds of different things having to do with climate change. So that's been really pretty cool.
Yeah.
And during the pandemic, I found that I didn't want to get as close to people in my practice as I might otherwise.
Right. Right. The
Yeah.
Reiki. Right. Yes.
Reasonable.
Being right up in people's faces.
Yes.
Um,
That's the
so
what is it? Craniosacral, you were saying?
Yeah, Reiki and craniosacral therapy.
Yep.
So
Yep.
they're both sort of light touch therapies that are they're considered a little bit far out.
Yeah. Like hippy
Yep.
dippy. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's really interesting because what they're working on is sort of how the body manages to heal itself, and
Yeah.
so as a therapist are really more of a facilitator to sort of bring these natural processes to the
Yeah.
fore.
Yeah.
So that's really cool to work on.
It seems like your observational skills, you seem like someone who has done multiple times, just hyper attentive to all these details and
Right.
collecting data and
Yeah,
noticing things.
as I
And
was looking at my life, what I realized was that I kind of became a student of how things change.
Mhm.
So how behavior changes. I mean, that was something that I was really interested in. I wrote this whole like little coda to my thesis about that,
Mm.
and how societies change and how social change happens and personal change within somebody. So about 2 years ago, I bought some land in rural Nova Scotia, and I'm now going kind of back to the healing center.
Mhm.
So I'm creating a healing center that I'm not going to be the only therapist there. I'm sort of bringing in
Yep.
other people. But it's a beautiful wild space. It's right near the ocean, and I'm
Mm.
actually we should talk about this. I'm actually trying to design a program specifically for new college students for
Oh,
the summer.
cool.
So
Yeah.
I was going to ask if any new college students had ever worked on the climate change work that you're doing too. I was wondering if
Well, it's very Nova Scotia oriented,
Mm.
and there's only a couple of new college students I know who have relationships with Nova Scotia.
And this is like northeast of Maine. This is in
Yeah,
Canada. Yeah.
It gets
mhm.
cold there.
Yeah. Because
It
we
does
think,
well, both,
but like
actually.
Americans, I think we also have. I mean, I'm also in Brooklyn here, but like we already think of Maine as like remote. And
and
like, no,
yeah.
you're just getting started, and then because then Newfoundland is further out than Nova Scotia.
Then yeah, Newfoundland is an island that's quite a bit further out.
Got it.
So Nova Scotia is a peninsula. It is attached to the mainland to New Brunswick, and then usually if you're going to Boston, you go through New Brunswick.
And it's part of Quebec, right? Or it's its own
Oh,
province.
it's
It's
its own.
own province. It's
Got
it's
it.
the easternmost province other than Newfoundland.
Got it. So it's east of Quebec, and then it's English speaking. Then
Yes, it is English speaking.
interesting. Little cultural snapshot for our listeners
Yeah,
there.
and it's kind of beautiful and huge amounts of coastline and
I've seen
lighthouses.
people do incredible photo essays of like just being out among like the rocks and
Yeah,
it's really that's what I'm saying. Like even my mental model of like Maine dialed up in terms of like ruggedness and
Lighthouses.
yeah,
remoteness. Yeah.
and my land is like 30 acres of woods, and it's surrounded on three sides by a wilderness area, and on the fourth there's just a 2-lane road and then the ocean.
And just
So
the other day, you posted a photo of a seal that had just appeared
yeah,
on your
a, little-
property.
a little baby seal, like still fluffy. It was very cute.
Aw.
What's the avian life like up there? Are any in friend
No
neighbors of
pelicans.
pelicans up there?
Actually, I guess I once saw some white pelicans, and they were inland. But yeah, lots of seabirds. I mean, certainly all kinds of seagulls and sandpipers and all those kind of guys. And
Petrels?
I haven't seen very many petrels,
Yeah.
but inland there's all kinds of songbirds and
Hmm.
owls. I found an enormous owl on the property, which was not a great horned owl. It was kind of owl I had never heard of before, called a great gray owl.
Hmm.
And they're supposed to be, their range is supposed to go out to Quebec, but this one apparently was deciding that it wanted to be.
Hmm. I mean, that's the part that's remarkable to me is like your through line there, like the lens through which you view the world seems to have been, even though your journey might have taken a bunch of turns, it seems like not the bird turned for those of you who are looking for jokes out there.
Yeah, no, yeah, no. My life journey has always made sense to me, and this is again kind of a new college thing. It's always made sense to me, even if it's never made sense to everybody else.
Yeah.
But in my healing center, it's definitely going to be continuing to be working on climate change, working with other animals. I'm attracting people who are nature healers and dance therapists.
Yeah.
And probably be creating, almost definitely will be creating a program with some Mi'kmaq grandmothers about kids who are, presently dropping out of high school or have dropped out.
Yeah. Almost like an outward bound kind of, yeah.
Yeah, but to be reconnected with their communities and nature through, the facilities
That's
that I'm.
awesome.
So that just happened a couple of weeks ago that
Congratulations. Yeah.
I'm making those plans. And that's, and that was actually kind of interesting because the way I approached it was I was meeting with someone who is a friend of a friend who had and I was like, well, given that I believe that First Nation sovereignty is a given here,
Hmm.
that this land is not my land, how can I best honor and in fact celebrate that? And she's like, well, you're making a healing center? Yeah, we can do something with that. So
That's awesome. Yeah.
and about maybe half an hour later, we had a plan. So it was really nice, from that perspective of, relationship based healing.
That's awesome. Yeah. And then there's like a link or something we could include in the show notes if folks want to see more of the stuff that you're doing.
Sure, I can link you to my webpage, but let
Cool.
me talk a little bit, if you want to, about this program that I'm trying to design.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, it's intended for between 4 and 8 students, and new college students will have the first priority. And I'm working with another alum whose name is Lorna Moon. She's considerably younger than me, but I don't know exactly what year she was at New College.
Yep.
Who is
And
that again?
Lorna Moon.
Oh, Lorna Moon. Okay.
And she is doing this really interesting kind of anthropological stuff with embodiment in nature and healing. And in particular, we're going to be using braiding sweetgrass
Yes. I know that book. Yeah.
and the spell of the sensuous. And she's going to be lecturing on those 2 books.
That's
And
awesome.
then I'm going to be creating external activities which kind of work off of what she's experiencing. And then I'll probably also be doing some hands-on healing work. And
Hmm.
there'll be woods,
So this will be in Nova Scotia and it's
Nova
open
Scotia.
to like with
Yeah,
preference for new college students. Yeah.
right. It'll be probably between August 7th and August 11th is the dates that we're thinking of.
Oh, aren't the Pleiades right around then too? I thought
Oh,
people.
it might be. I don't know, but there's a really
And
beautiful. There's actually a facility sort of nearby us that we're working with called the Deanery Project, which is more interested in sort of natural building and environmental education through art.
Hmm.
And they do a lot of night sky stuff. So
That's
if
awesome.
the teams are out, and it's also, I think it might be around the time of year when the waves become iridescent with like little.
Oh, wow.
the phosphorescence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah,
assuming we
warm
survive.
waters when that
We
happens. yeah.
survive the totality and we all make it through
Right. It is
the eclipse. Yes. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
And
That's
Solar
Eurovision.
flares.
Oh, right. And
Oh, yeah.
Eurovision will have happened by then too. My gosh. Yeah. It's a real confluence. And the Olympics. Come on.
Go
Yeah,
Finland.
but having the woods and the ocean, and I'm also hoping to be able to get people sea kayaking because there's a really
Awesome.
nice
Yeah.
center nearby. And
That
be able
sounds fantastic. How can people apply to this? How can they
Well,
do
so
it?
we're just finishing up trying to get the write up done. So I was hoping to, in fact, I'm a few days late. I had promised Lorna that I would have that last bit done. But we're hoping to get that final write up out, and then, I'll be trying to get it out to the students. One of the things that I'm actually probably going to need people's help with is that it's probably not going to be all that well highly approved of by the present powers at New College. And that was
Sure. Yeah.
why we decided to do it. It was kind of like a gift to those students of some of the kinds of information that they might find harder to get under the new regime.
Yeah.
So it's a bit subversive in purpose of to be like, hey, well, if you're not getting it through the university, maybe you can get this kind of
Mm,
education through the alumni.
Interesting.
So
yeah.
I'd love to encourage other alumni if they had other sort of projects that they thought maybe some of the present new college students, and to me, it's not just the older ones, but
Right.
the younger ones who might be interested too, could sort of do to make sure that some of those ideas have a little bit extra life.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about New College as a cultural movement. Like this is almost an example of that, where like there's now an initiative to almost erase that history. So like if alums are able to kind of formulate these small, yours is probably relatively big, honestly, but like what we can to kind of preserve and sort of pay forward that history to these folks. Because say what you want about some of the challenges with New College, I do think it did both
Yeah.
kind of expose us to more than maybe what you would typically get as an
Yeah, no,
undergrad.
it really did, and I am able certainly to be very aware of the fact that first of all, my experience wasn't everybody's experience, and also that there was a huge amount that was really valuable that
Mhm,
is you're being lost or it's way to being lost,
mhm.
depending on how hopeful you feel. And, in some ways, I don't know if there would be continuing interest in this in future years, but I at least wanted to do this once
Yeah,
and kind of as a gift. And
that's awesome.
I'm
Yeah,
also trying to make it so that nobody gets turned away because they can't afford it. I mean, the costs are going to be pretty low in the first place. It's probably
yeah.
going to be $800 for 5 days. But if there's a particular student that wants to go and can't afford it, then I'm going to find a way for that student to be able to go.
Sounds amazing. I mean, it also ties into a lot of like the, expeditionary experiential learning, like a lot of the stuff, like even your example of being in the tree with the Pelicans is very much like evocative. That's why it was in the admissions brochures, is because
Yeah,
like
I
it is
suppose
kind of,
that's really true. I mean, and yes, honestly, that was new college. I mean, my ability to, however it turned out, my ability to spend that year in the tree, taking notes on the project that I designed,
mhm.
that was part of what had drawn me to new college in the first place.
It's interesting when we talk to more folks too, because like we all have these very varied and sort of twisty, turny paths through life, but it does feel like, there was a very formative stage at which like our internal gyroscope was allowed to kind of point somewhere. And, frequently that results in a through line to the narrative that is, I think, meaningful. And that's part of why we're doing this podcast, honestly, is just to try to like surface a little more of that. We're getting close to time here. I don't know if folks have final questions, final thoughts.
I,
Yeah.
I had one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Susan, because I think you were part of the Lorax Rebellion, and I just wanted to
Oh
ask you
yeah.
about that. If you could tell us a little bit
Uh,
about what that was like for you.
Okay, well, yeah, that actually was life changing.
Yeah.
That's
That might be a whole other hour.
Maybe just a short
Well,
version.
this is a tease. We'd love to
It's a
have you
tease.
back too, but at least the
We
brief,
should have a
brief version.
Lorax Rebellion
and
episode.
I
Yes.
and then in that case, you should definitely talk to John White as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
But, my relationship with the trees is pretty high to begin with, and I had been in that grove and spent time there, and it just pissed me off so much what was intended for that space and the whole way that there wasn't any input from the college, and it was all the powerful people doing their powerful things. And so, when it was a chance to camp out there in the land. Well, so we were trying, yeah, there really should be a whole show, but we were trying to do it as legally as we could. And we actually got an injunction. And then and they got the injunction on a Friday. And in between the Friday and the Monday it was supposed to take into effect, the airport decided to take down all the trees. So we were trying
Is this like
to
fall of '88 or so? Is that right?
Yeah.
mediate.
Because it was right when I got there. Because I remember I had just read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which
I,
begins
I
with
think I
the
think I think
bulldozing.
the only students like me. So it was fall of '88, spring of '88. As
Oh,
far as
okay, maybe it had just happened then. Okay.
Yeah.
but the students who were still on campus were still under the possibility of dealing with their arrests and all that other kind of stuff. I had
Yes.
already left town,
Mm.
and ended up being told, okay, it's been thrown out. But yeah, so we were trying to hold them off long enough for the injunction to go into effect, which is why we were there. I mean, the idea was if we can like physically hold off the machines to keep from taking down these trees, then we've got some power here.
Yeah.
And I was known for supposedly having dived in front of one of the machines, but actually what happened was I tripped in front of the machine. But then this big SWAT guy, like 200-pound guy, just like, sort of like picked me up. And it was the first time I'd ever been completely physically overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a small woman, no matter how tough a small woman you are, that experience of being complete physical power of somebody else is really intense. So yeah, there is probably more there.
Yeah, I think it would be
Yeah.
worth
I like that idea of getting more participants
Absolutely.
in that. Yeah. Back on,
I have to ask because this seems relevant to something you brought up earlier. Were you aware or had you heard that the bulldozers actually released uranium from pottery glaze into that area? Because it seems like that's a weird echo.
Oh,
Like-
wait, seriously?
Seriously, this is something that came up in a conversation in Damon, the Facebook group, where
You're not just kidding me. No, I had no.
I'm not
I mean,
kidding.
if there was a conversation in the Damon, it had to have
Yeah.
happened.
But apparently the deal is Jack Cartilage was improperly storing some radioactive pottery glazes that were, you get that nice green from uranium. Right?
Wow.
But nobody knew about it. It was like in a paper bag somewhere that he's just like, don't touch that. And then the bulldozers came and got the Grove and got the art barracks and all that stuff. And like that stuff is somewhere under the Sarasota airport now.
Wow.
No, I didn't know that at all.
Yeah. So
Maybe
there's
we should crowdfund
interesting
some
echo
Geiger
there.
counters. We should crowdfund some Geiger counters.
Oh my God.
I mean, I'm sure it's not as concentrated as stuff runoff from Los Alamos, but still.
Yeah. But nice callback though, Grant. That's good. That will keep all these stories fresh in
Yeah.
our listeners.
Talk about through
Esoteric,
lines.
Yeah.
There's the through line for you.
Yeah. But thank you so much for joining, Susan. Any final words, final thoughts as we wrap up here?
No, nothing in particular. I appreciate that you were willing to hear my mixed feelings.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was interesting sort of having those mixed feelings and then feeling like it would still be just as huge a loss to lose the place completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's how we all feel. It's very complex, and it's like a family essentially, with all the dysfunction that entails.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll close with that. Thanks again, Susan Hirshberg, for joining us on today's episode.
Well, thank you. And actually, you didn't get to see the dog. but-
Yeah. Oh, right. We
oh.
definitely want to see the dog. Absolutely.
Come on. Yes.
There we go.
Aw.
Oh, yeah. Look at that.
Good.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll be back again soon. This is the Palm Court Podcast.
Okay. Bye.